Hi, my name is Burke and I'm the Research Project Analyst at the Deep River Public Library. Since 2022, the Deep River Library and partners have been co-leading this local history project titled Not Born from a Virgin Forest, Deep River and Area's Earliest History. The title of this project is derived from early recorded accounts of Virginia Adams Hunt, who proposed that the area that we now call Deep River had housed families for decades prior to the arrival of the town, and therefore Deep River was not born from a virgin forest. This project was started in response to requests to expand understanding of life in our area prior to 1945. I'd like to thank our partners, the Schoolhouse Museum, the Laurentian Hills Library, Professor Stephanie Adams, Alex Stevens of Deep Tech, the Deep River District Community Foundation, and to the New Horizons for Seniors grant, who generously funded this project and made our work possible. The following oral history that you're about to watch is a subjective first-person account, an individual recording of life in the early days of Deep River and area. We hope that by asking questions and capturing responses, we're able to add these oral histories to our collection of historical accounts to expand understanding. Enjoy.
Hi, Brian.
Good afternoon, Liz.
I'm so happy to be here with you.
Good.
Yeah,
Good.
We've known each other well for about 15 years now.
At least.
But I don't think we've ever really talked about how deep your roots go back in this area. So I'm really excited about this chat.
Oh, good. Yeah. Yes, they go back a ways.
And those roots give you a pretty intense understanding of homesteading in this area. So give me your first thoughts about that.
Sure. First of all, I'll just give a little introduction. Two things that I'd like to bring up. One, a number of things that I'm going to say are absolutely factual. Mm-hmm. And some things, because I wasn't born in the 1860s, I have to speculate on because I have witnessed how my great-grandparents established themselves in this area.
Yeah.
And this area is not Deep River. It's 3 miles south of here along what used to be the CPR line. Mm-hmm. So anyway, the first homesteaders suffered the same anxiety caused by climate anxiety that we are facing today. They too were facing the threat of death from freezing or starving, but didn't deny their reality. They maintained their hope through critical thinking, blood, sweat, and tears, and died working on their feet. Yeah. And that's how they got to where they got to.
Yeah.
And that's how the homestead farm on Josie Lane that Phil and Heather Pentney bought from me, all the buildings, et cetera, are the result of the work that my great-grandparents and grandparents did.
Yes. Now that was the Rathwell family.
That's the Rathwell homestead.
The Rathwell homestead.
Most what you would call farms in this area were homesteaded farms where mm-hmm. people would literally hack the bush down to the point of having maybe 20 or 30 acres cleared, and then they were allotted from the government of the day 100 acres. And they established over time, over a period of over 100 years, 800 acres. So wow. they worked really hard on lousy soil.
Yeah, yeah. You said blood, sweat, and tears there, and
oh, yeah.
I'm sure a lot of that went. So take us back to the beginning. How did the Rathwells end up on that Josie Lane homestead, which is just to the west of Deep River, sort of
yes.
area?
They arrived there on the train. The CP line was not actually built across Canada at the time. It wasn't completed. So where the railway ended, they literally would have gotten off the train, my great-grandmother and my great-grandfather, whose names are John Rathwell and Honora Rathwell / O'Shaughnessy, and they moved up to this area from Douglas, Ontario.
Okay.
There's still a large clan of Rathwells in Douglas, enough to make up a baseball team, I hear. So they would have come off the train and started hacking the bush and trying to get as much food together for their first winter of survival, basically. I don't know how they did it, but they did.
Yeah, a deep
Yeah.
well of strength that they would have been drawing from.
Yeah, they were so much like so many immigrants. I think the people who came to North and South America initially basically were refugees because things were so bad in Europe, they had to get out.
Yeah.
And so they got out and did what they did here. And things have evolved pretty much back into what they left. Things really need to change. But anyway, that's another story.
So you were mentioning from Europe, and with a great-grandmother having the maiden name O'Shaughnessy, I'm guessing they came from Ireland?
Yes, and it's typical of where the Irish and Polish were sent to find their fortune, so to speak, because the Opeongo line is still in existence, but the first winter, there are many documentaries on it. The Polish and Irish were sent up there to establish themselves, and most of them died the first winter from starvation and freezing. And the soil, as anyone knows in that area, is very poor and very rocky. And the whole area was established through working in the bush, basically. Same in this area. All of Renfrew County, west of Pembroke, is trees and rocks and lakes, and that's it. Yeah.
So I know you know that homestead like the back of your hand.
Yes.
Can you describe, when John and Honora came off that train, they would have seen what vision for their...
Well, it was before the lumber barons hit the area. The law at the time was you couldn't cut pine trees because the pine was allotted to lumber barons. And so I'm sure they cut pine, I'm sure they cut everything down they could just to make room for a farm.
Yeah.
Or fields or whatever. But there were no fields as we know them. They literally cut areas down. And at the homestead, which is out near the railway track, still it's on concession 3, would be lot 18. They established a house there, pretty much identical to the one that Phil and Heather live in. And you can still walk that area and see mounds of small rocks piled all through the bush that has grown up since they cleared and piled rocks in a clearing so they could sow potatoes, carrots, or some grain maybe. I don't know, I wasn't there, but it was subsistence. And yeah, I really don't know how they toughed it, but they did.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cutting those big trees by hand,
Yes.
digging out those rocks,
Yep.
building their houses.
Absolutely.
Were there large families in the that ran in the Rathwell?
Relatively.
Yeah.
I'm speculating the number. My grandfather had, I think, 3 brothers and a sister, so there would have been 5 of them. And he had 8 children. And they were all birthed, of course, at home because there were no hospitals around. So basically, yeah, I guess they had what they had in terms of raising children. Obviously had enough food, but the food they would have had at the time because the area was fairly unpopulated. So there was lots of bears and deer and moose if they needed food. And they shot and ate and preserved that meat to survive. And you know, the typical pigs, chickens, and sheep, etc., probably came after the fact once they got some money from producing some wood, I guess. They sold wood to the railway because the railway was powered by steam engines. So steam engines needed wood and or coal. They could burn either. So where they settled, there was a watering tower right near the lake that they established themselves near. They would have cut wood and sold it to the railway for pennies probably, but those pennies bought the essentials like cookware, salt, pepper, flour, the staples of life. And they managed, obviously.
Yeah.
Yeah, so they would have been cutting some lumber to subsidize their homesteading. And what other sort of things do you think they would have been doing to make a bit of cash money?
You got me there, because I don't think there was a lot of cash around. Very little. So if they needed money, I don't know where they would have got it, or you know, they would have produced logs for the bush and sold them. They trapped, and they sold some of the furs. So there wasn't a lot of money.
Right.
There couldn't have been. Everybody was subsistence living, so they didn't need money because they grew everything they needed and probably bartered or begged for whatever they could get. Yeah.
Maybe they depended on their neighbors quite a bit too.
No, there were no neighbors.
Okay, tell me a bit about that, the isolation.
Okay. Well, right now, if you walk a mile into the bush around here, there's nothing. So they were 3 miles from the river, and there was traffic on the river. There was traffic on the railroad, and that's where they would have bumped into other people. But I think they were too busy working to survive to bother doing anything else. Yeah. So most people were probably a mile or two from each other when they homesteaded. So it was a long way to go if you had an accident. So you didn't have accidents.
So you mentioned traveling by the river as well as by rail. Now, what happened when they put the road through? How did that affect the Rathwells?
Well, that was part of what opened up Canada. Was the rail system obviously opened up the country to immigrants. All the waterways were used for access to whatever and wherever people decided to settle. But what's called the Pembroke-Mattawa Highway was a bush road cut not much wider than a concession, which is 66 feet. And it was used to transit all kinds of goods, but mainly wood. Horses and sleighs. All the wood that was transited in the wintertime would have been on sleighs, taken to the river, dumped in the river, taken in booms, and processed downriver from this area, every area. Like Algonquin Park, that's what they did. And the railroad through Algonquin Park, which used to be CN, originally was built by a fellow by the name of J.R. Booth. And he built the railway through the park to transit the logs that he was cutting in the park out. So it was all about economy, money, and making the best access to the resources to make money.
Right.
Yeah, but the people who came here to settle and make a life for themselves, they didn't have any money, and they scrounged and made livings and made farms and whatever. That's how they made money, was to sell trees and maybe some of the produce they had.
So when the road came in, is that when the original Rathwell homestead moved up towards the road and they built the newer
Well,
farmhouse?
where my great-grandfather and his wife settled, they had that house there, and it was there until the 1950s. It was burned down, unfortunately. But before then, they moved their homestead, which was not just a house, there was a large barn. That barn is now on Josie Lane, where Heather and Phil live. And it was taken down. Each log was marked with a number, and it was brought from the railway tracks to Josie Lane and re-erected to establish a barn, because they couldn't build too many barns. This wasn't the resource then. So they built it again and established themselves on Josie Lane, which is about 1 mile. It's actually 1.2 miles from what would have been the Pembroke-Mattawa Highway, which gave them access to Point Alexander. It gave them access to Chalk River. It gave them access to Pembroke. Not many people from this area would have gone west to Mattawa unless they were planning on moving there, because Mattawa was a very small settlement too. So they established themselves on Josie Lane and did well. Yeah.
So in addition to moving the barn, they also built a new farmhouse, is that right?
They did, yes.
And I've seen that farmhouse.
Yeah.
I grew up contemporaries with your daughter, and I've
Yes.
been in that farmhouse, and
Yes.
it has stood the test of time.
Yes.
What can you tell me about building that beautiful farmhouse?
It was very interesting. It's a work in progress. Initially, there were hewn pine logs, which means they're squared timbers, and the building is tied together with dovetail joints. So that was built. But it was originally built on a stone foundation, with just piles of stones. And as time went on, and they had time and energy to do it, and I guess some money, the house was jacked up, it was dug out, cribs were made, stones were put in those cribs, because cement and lime at the time was probably very expensive. Stones were available and cheap and free. So the basement is about 2 feet thick, and it's a poured basement with stones. But when I moved there, I must say, I lived on Josie Lane for 57 years. So I'm very familiar with how things evolved. When I moved there, the house had been vacant for 10 years. There was nobody in it, so it was in disrepair, in such bad shape I couldn't even live in it. A friend of mine, J.C. Laverne, and I lived in what was called a cookhouse, which was my grandmother's summer cookhouse. She had a stove out there, so in the summertime you didn't cook in the house and heat it up, you cooked outside. Well, not outside, but in a small. So we actually put bunks in there, lived in there, worked on the house for a good 2 months before we could actually move in, because it was in such disrepair. But amazingly, it has 2-inch pine floors, and on top of that, tongue and groove hardwood. So it's in great shape, and yeah, it's not going to go anywhere.
The craftsmanship that went into that house
Oh.
is unbelievable, especially considering the tools they were working with when they would have built it. What can you say about that?
The tools were, first of all, when you take a log, you have to make a line the full length of the log on either side as to where you're going to, how much of the slab wood you're going to cut off. And then you take what's called a scoring axe, which is a heavy axe with a very rounded nose to it, and you hack into the log as far as you need to go to that line. And then you take the broad axe, which is a flat side to it, and you go along and you chip off the slab work, and you have squared timber. And the men at the time were terribly skilled because the logs are very, very flat and straight. And the dovetails were made by this fellow by the name of Mick Foley, and he was from Foresters Falls. And he would have been a much sought after tradesman who cut these dovetail joints perfectly. And he did the barn, he did the house, and he did probably John King's farm. He probably did the stopping place in Point Alexander, which used to be belonged to a fellow by the name of Garnet McKay. It's not there anymore because it was torn down and used to build a house on Burke's Road, actually. A fellow by the name of Don Bull bought that old place and moved it down. Now, stopping places were like King's Farm, McKay's. They were bigger establishments, but they were established after 1885. And my great-grandparents settled out near the tracks in the 1860s. So they were around here for a long time doing their thing. And then when you can see how things evolved, and the stopping places were for people to stay overnight and then go on and traveling from, say, North Bay to Ottawa, if you did that. But you had to do it by horse. That was it. There were no cars.
So this Pembroke-Mattawa Highway is not really the highway we might be thinking of today. It was a bit more rudimentary.
It was a bush road. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And any family stories about that bush road, either traveling on it or?
Well, I guess it was in the early 1900s. There was several schools established in this area, some on ACL property, some in Chalk River, one in Point Alexander, which is on the corner of Browse Road and Bass Lake Road, right on the corner. I forget the name of the people who own it now, but that was a school, and that school got sold to Guy Dumanoir, who was Imperial Oil distributor for this area for years. And his family sold it to whoever lives there now. But that was, and still is, the original schoolhouse.
Okay.
And so from Josie Lane to there would have been basically 3 miles or 5 kilometers. And they had to walk down Josie Lane to the Pembroke-Mattawa Highway and walk up there all when the school was open. And it was, wood stove, this, that, the other thing, very cool, cold. And my mother told me that they had to jump off the road when the horses and sleighs came by with loads of logs, and she got her wrist broken because a horse kicked her one day. And that was the way things were. So life was, I think, slower but more difficult too. Yeah.
More difficult, I'm
Yeah.
sure.
And they all valued education, and the whole family, except for my Aunt Nora, which is my mother's older sister, finished what they called school at the time in grade 8 and worked for a living, either at home or they went somewhere to earn money to send money home to keep their parents and keep life going. My Aunt Nora went to the convent school in Pembroke, and she graduated with a grade 12. And that was big education in those days. But they valued education. very respected, and they all, you know, even my great-grandparents could read, and that's in the 1860s. It wasn't common for everybody to be literate, but I think that's one of the reasons that mainstayed the Rathwells, is they could read. They knew what math was. They could figure out dollars and cents and weights and measures, which was crucial. Yeah.
So you mentioned these large families. You mentioned that there was one of your ancestors' family had 8 children, something like that.
Well, my mother's family, they were all born in the house on Josie Lane. And the lady who was the midwife was married to a Francoeur. They had in concession 4 was, Rathwells were established in concession 3. Francoeurs were the homesteaders in concession 4. And the original homesteader was a man by the name of Louis Francoeur, who would have been French Canadian. And there was a midwife in that family, and she obviously went everywhere in this area to birth children. Yeah. So that was it for hospitalization.
And I'm wondering, do you think multiple generations would have lived in the same home together?
Absolutely. I'm the last of the Rathwell heritage to live in that house. But there was like 3 generations before me, so I would have been the 4th. And I raised my children there, and it was great. Yeah, beautiful.
I imagine that growing old on a homestead back then would still have entailed some hard work.
It was very interesting because when the Swisha Dam was built, it was a major war effort because the war was what it was. We needed energy to produce all kinds of weaponry, etc. So when it was built and the transmission line was put through from the Swisha Dam to atomic energy, you needed that electricity to build atomic energy. So my father worked with the Dominion Foundries Company to build that, and then he transitioned to work at AECL once it was established. But that transmission line went right through the front yard at Josie Lane, where my grandparents lived. That was in 1949, and they had the opportunity at the time, I've been told, because the neighbors got electricity, they didn't. They never had what's called running water. They had a cistern pump. They never had electricity. And they lived and died in that house, and were waked in that house too. That was absolutely common. There were no funeral homes outside of, I think, Pembroke at the time. So I remember distinctly going to both their wakes in what I had as my dining room. Yeah, yeah. It was, you know, the cycle of life was very, very usual for most families. There wasn't a whole lot of fanciness or celebrations at funeral homes or whatever. Yeah.
You shared with me a wonderful photo of your grandmother, Christina, milking a cow in her old age at the Josie Lane farm.
Yes.
What does that photo make you feel?
A couple of things. I mentioned to you before, I went to the Schoolhouse Museum to look up the census on the Rathwell homestead. And I was shocked to find that my mother's mother, her maiden name was Christine McKay, and she was registered as Protestant. Rathwell family was Catholic. She was also registered as a servant, and I couldn't figure that one out.
In the Rathwell home?
Yeah, she was, yeah. So what happened, I gather, was she and my grandfather decided to get married and raise children there. It wasn't uncommon in those days, or even up as late as the 1940s, for families who had children they couldn't actually take care of or feed properly to farm them out to other families or relatives. And I don't know the case. So my grandmother, I can see from this picture, she's on one knee milking a cow like it's not a big deal. This is what we do. And very, very resilient people. And I can't say, like some people would say perhaps the word tough. But tough has a very different translation now. These people were kind and gentle for the most part. They toughed it out. But there wasn't this machismo thing of being tough. They couldn't mess up. You couldn't get into fights and get injured and do silly stuff because you wouldn't have survived. It's long and short of it. Yeah. So, yeah, she's doing her thing, and some of the things that she did that were amazing, like during the war. None of my family were conscripted, I guess because they were farmers, but they did raise sheep, they did produce wool, they did spin the wool, they did knit socks and mitts and ship them over to the soldiers. So that was their war contribution as best they could, and it was done by everybody in the country. Wasn't idiosyncratic to my ancestors, but everybody was doing it to support the war effort, so to speak. Anyway, yeah, she's an amazing woman. I really only knew her briefly. I was very, very young when she passed away, but I did know who she was. Mm-hmm.
And I'm guessing there may have been a few very strong women in the Rathwell line.
Goodness. Amazing. Just my mother's oldest sister, her name was Mary. She married a fellow from Haileybury, and she ran a farm there. Her next oldest sister, Nora Gleason, married Billy Gleason. She ran the farm on the Wiley Road, which is on what's called Gleason's Lane. That was a 500-acre homestead. It was huge. And who would be referred to at the time, everybody on the Wiley Road was very connected. Every family knew every other family. And the post office in the day was at the Gleason farm. And my father's aunt raised him because his mother died when he was like 3 or 4 months old. So, and that, I couldn't figure that one out. She was from Sheenborough originally. She was a slattery, and she had 4 or 5 children, my dad being the youngest, but she died from childbirth 3 months later, so obviously she became pregnant after my dad was born in January. She died in March of the same year. So there would have been a lot of frantic movement around to take care of him. And he wound up with his aunt on Gleason's farm on the Wiley Road and was raised there as an orphan. But that's the family he related to. Like, he referred to them as his first cousins, but they would have been more like brothers and sisters to him. And very, very close. So, like, he married my mother, who was a Rathwell, and one of his first cousins married a Rathwell too. So 2 members from one family married 2 members, but they weren't related. And it's, yeah.
Tight-knit community.
Very tight-knit community. Everybody knew who Grandma Gleason was. Yeah, she's a powerful woman. She had 13 children, adopted my dad, had 3 sets of twins, ran a farm. So.
And I'm thinking this may have been close to the time of the Depression as well.
Oh, they all lived through basically 2 world wars and a depression. Yeah, for sure. Oh, yeah.
And how do you think the families in this tight-knit community helped each other through those difficult times?
There were no homeless people. Nobody was on the street. If there was somebody who was in need, they were farmed out to another household. We had my mother's family on Josie Lane had a lady by the name of Laura Gracie, who would have been Henry Adams' stepmother, so to speak, because Henry was raised with his uncle Henry and Laura Gracie on Wiley Road. And there was a lot of that on the Wiley Road and in the area. And Laura Gracie lived at the Rathwell farm for years. And her family was, for whatever reason, in rough times and had to live somewhere else and work for room and board, basically, which was fine, you know. So that's how people actually were much more compassionate, I'd say, and kind, rather than housing them in long-term care centers.
So that sounds like it would have built some pretty strong relationships between the families in this area.
Oh, I don't think there would have been a whole lot of strife at the time between families, because everyone was farming to survive the winters and, you know, keep a roof over your head and keep healthy and just live life, you know. And they did well. They had their own music. They had violins, mandolins, guitars, and they shared that music from the Wiley Road, Chalk River, to probably as far west as, say, Rolfton. And that would have taken in quite a few families.
So you think there was a few parties at the Rathwell farm?
Oh, there and Keen's farm, where Gerald Natto established his house. My mother said they went to Keen's farm and they'd stay overnight. They'd party all night and get in the buggy and come home in the morning type thing, and just keep going. They were very religious too. You know, the Catholic Church was a huge influence in this area on families. So everybody, you know, there were no Christmas presents to speak of. People got together for meals, and they definitely went to church regardless of how cold it was. So then they'd get in a buggy or a cutter and the horses, and that's how they got around. People, I think, since the 1950s can't imagine commuting on a horse, but that was the mode of travel.
So where would they have gone to Catholic church services?
The first Catholic so-called mission would have been at a place called McCarthy's Farm on the Wiley Road. The man there, his name was Fleury McCarthy, Florient, F-L-U-O-R-E-N-T, McCarthy. And I think each Sunday, if you could go there, and I think the numbers would be limited in the winter because you had to be inside, but in the summer, as many people as could get there would go. And then there was a church built right near where St. Mary's School is now. And that was the parish church for many, many years. Yeah. So that was it.
Now, Brian, you once told me a wonderful story about how your Rathwell ancestors shared eggs. Would you mind telling us that story?
Oh my goodness. They had neighbors on Josie Lane who were destitute and hurting for food. And because my grandparents and their family and their kids had to be disciplined and organized, had enough food. And they knew this family did not have enough food, so they would literally walk down Josie Lane and give them as many eggs as they could share at the time, and that families would get maybe half a dozen eggs, and if there were 7 kids in the family, somebody went without. So that was what happened. And very interestingly, every Sunday, once there was a bigger population, like when my great-grandparents established themselves, nobody lived in the area. When my grandparents were living on Josie Lane, more people had settled in the area. So the locals, whoever they were friends, they'd get together Sunday afternoons and they'd hunt deer for food year-round, but not so much in the winter. And there weren't too many laws in the day. So they might go out and shoot 4 or 5 deer, which would not hurt the deer population in the area because it was very, very populated with deer, moose, and bears at the time. So they would butcher the deer and share it. And one of the ways that Gerald Nadeau told me that was very, very interesting is in a well, they would leave a rock stuck out. If it was a rock stone well, there would be one rock out of place. And often, when you made your butter up, you would lower that butter down into the well and it would sit on that rock. And it would stay semi-solid. It wouldn't melt away for sure. And that's where a lot of refrigeration was done in the summertime. In the wintertime, everybody cut ice and had ice huts and so on, or ice houses for preserving food in the summertime. Or in the wintertime, they had root cellars. Every farm had a root cellar. I remember that distinctly. When I grew up on Burke's Road, we had a root cellar. Our root cellar was actually it was a dirt. The house was built, but there was a trapdoor that went down to sand. And the, turnips, carrots, etc., potatoes were buried in the sand and kept all winter, no problem. So people knew how to survive. Yeah. But everybody carried water or pumped water for sure. Yeah. There were no drilled wells.
Another Rathwell story I have a faint memory of has to do with your great-grandfather and his accident.
Oh my goodness, yes. Well, the factual part of this is he was coming home from partying with some friends in Chalk River, didn't quite make it home, fell asleep on the railway tracks, and I don't guess, obviously he was sleeping with one of his legs on the rail, and train came along and cut his leg off below the knee.
Wow.
He survived that. Don't ask me how, I have no clue. But years later, one of his sons who worked for the CPR in Sudbury and North Bay area, that was the employment in the area. There was no AECL, so the employment was the railroad or go work in the bush or maybe go to mining somewhere. So my ancestors, I have an uncle, my mother's youngest brother, was an engineer for his whole career with CPR, and other relatives were too. And so one of John Rathwell's sons sent him a prosthetic in the 1950s, I think, and that's what he managed to hobble around on. And he was apparently would be ill-tempered, and if somebody irritated him the wrong way, he'd take that off, and that was his weapon. True or not true, I don't know. I wasn't there. But I wouldn't doubt that kind of shenanigans went on at times. Not very often, though.
So I guess we can only speculate that he was patched up by someone at home or some neighbors with some medical.
Probably his wife would have stitched him up. My dad had a similar accident. He was a kid at the Gleason farm, and they would turn a wheelbarrow upside down and wrap binder twine around the wheel and pull it and watch the wheel spin, and it was a kick. Well, he had the binder twine wrapped around his finger, and he pulled it, but the string didn't come off the wheel, and the momentum of the wheel sucked his hand back in, and it tore the first knuckle of his finger off. And his aunt literally poured, and this is words from my father, poured turpentine on his finger and sewed it up with a thread and needle. And yeah, he had one finger that was missing a knuckle.
So a little bit of home care.
Oh, you had to, everybody took care. My grandfather, my mother's father, was very good with animals, and he would have done veterinarian things if animals, cows particularly, got bloated, which means they got into too much rich food and got gas, they would die. So he would, my mother operated with him on it. She didn't do the operation, he did. They literally took a bottle and broke the big part off and kept the neck. And this cow was bloated beyond belief. And he just took a knife, and there's a spot just forward of the back hip bone where it's all skin, but that's where the gut of the cow would come up to. And my mother said, plunge the knife in there, cut a slot in, put the neck of the bottle in there, and out came all the grass and stuff to ease the pressure and save the animal, because they couldn't afford to lose animals, so they really took care of things.
So they maybe would have learned some of these things from passed down from generations, learned from neighbors.
Absolutely. Like, nobody went to vet school, or you had to learn on your feet, to survive, yeah.
You've really painted a picture of this community, this legacy of a community.
Yeah, it was a community, yeah. It was very, very tightly knit. Their neighbors, Frankiers, were close to them. Gleasons, there were Keens, there were Stewarts, there were all kinds of people in the area who came down the line after my great-grandfather and his wife established themselves here, yeah.
So I'd say it sounds like they're a tight-knit community and self-sufficient among themselves.
Absolutely, yeah. Everybody took care of themselves. Like, one of the sad stories in my mind anyway is that when the Rathwell farm was vacant at Josie Lane, I won't go into the detail, it was vacant for 10 years, but the house was ransacked and pillaged, and one of the things that I missed, that I saw, was my great-grandmother's spinning wheel. And some local people stole it, and it got sold in an antique shop locally. And I wasn't aware, I was away at the time, so I wasn't aware of that. So when I moved back here, I moved into Josie Lane and reestablished it, made it. Well, I spent 57 years rebuilding it, and so it's great. And I'm glad, and the right people are living there now. which is great.
So I'm guessing that when the National Research Council came to town and ACL came to town, that must have been a pretty big shakeup for this community.
It was very, very good in many, many ways. My father worked there, not for a long time, but did work there. He worked there longer. He was a skilled tradesman. He was a plumber, steam fitter, pipe fitter. So he worked at Swisher Dam when it was built, and then he worked at ACL when it was built. So he worked wherever he could find work outside of the farm. So that's how he got his cash, so to speak. And, you know, the history of Deep River and area is pretty well documented. No mysteries, you know, it's a town that grew out of support and not too much hardship because of the times. 1940s weren't as tough as the 1860s. So, yeah, everything evolves into what we have now. So yeah, it was the partition, if I can use that word, between cultures. Deep River was a culture basically unto itself. The people of the area, from say Chalk River to Rolfton, were one community, and the manner in which, and I guess part of it was the secrecy of developing nuclear energy for the war, this was a gated community, which was very, you know, everybody before ACL would come and go as they pleased. There was no exclusion, but over time it became a tense situation between the surrounding community and Deep River, conflicts and prejudices, etc. But most of that, I would say, and that prejudice went both ways. It wasn't just the prejudice of the elite, wealthy people of Deep River against the local yokels. A lot of the local yokels had no respect for what was done here and established. You know, it's an amazing heritage for Canada. You know, developing nuclear energy. It's fabulous, and things are much better now. Let's put it that way. Yeah. So yeah, it had a big influence, and same with the base Petawawa. Most of the Stewart family that lives in this area were homesteaders on this property, what would be referred to as the Petawawa Plains. All those people had their houses burned and smashed and were told to leave, and there was great friction between the military and the local people at the time because they were bullied and pushed around without any consideration or compensation even. So it was tough. It was tough in, you know, after the First World War. Yeah.
Right.
So people are more connected now, even though I feel in some ways people are cocooning a lot more than ever happened in the 1920s or 30s.
So do you think that the European scientists who came here, do you think they had a true understanding of what like your ancestors and their neighbors would have gone through?
No, they wouldn't have a clue. They wouldn't relate, not in any fashion. They couldn't. They had no. Well, they had running water. They had indoor plumbing. And my grandparents never had that, and they died like that. So, and they died in the 60s. So there was no relatable relationships between people who came from Europe in the 1940s and the local people. No, they had no appreciation of them, and probably very little regard to. And then it evolved into the same back at you attitude of the local people, which was unfortunate. And not just unfortunate, it caused a lot of strife and prejudices and conflicts, which didn't have to be, you know. But that was another time. I can't go there. I have no idea.
So, looking back, I know you're a grandpa now.
I don't think of that too often, but I am.
What do you hope future generations understand about the legacy that your Rathwell ancestors left through their hard work on Josie Lane?
It's kind of happenstance if somebody in a family now is interested in continuing a business, a farm, or living in the same area that their parents did. The demands of the economy, housing, simply people surviving, even though your generation is the most educated generation this country has ever had, they are the least employed in their fields. And it's really something this country has to work on. But as a legacy for what would be called the Rathwell homestead, I have 2 children. Neither of them could work in this area because there wasn't work for them. Both are educated, both are intelligent enough to do whatever, but they can't make a living here because they're not employed here. I mean, specifically, you have to be either an entrepreneur or work for ACL or be involved with the military somehow, and they're not. So they're not here. My hope for, say, my grandchild is that I live long enough to take her into the bush and show her what living with nature is about. People like you and younger will have to actually read and do this kind of thing to get an appreciation for what happened. I appreciate what happened because I grew up with it. I grew up on Burke's Road. We didn't have flush toilet until I was probably 13 or 14. We burned wood. Times were much tougher. So you have to understand that there's a great divide in terms of how people were raised wherever they were raised, and the establishment of communities. Like Deep River is atypical. It is what it's another story, but small towns that are similar to what would have been Point Alexander, Chalk River, Ralston, Bizzett Creek, the small communities, Petawawa before the military came there. Pembroke is an example of a thriving community because they've got good soil and good farming there. And that's where the money, it was a center for money. So that if like for my 2 children, really appreciate what they went through in terms of being raised on Josie Lane. My granddaughter hopefully will understand it. She's only 2, so it's going to be a while. That's why I said I hope I live long enough to introduce her to so many things, like planting a garden, how to manufacture a tree without destroying the bush, da-da-da-da-da-da. There's so many things that have to, that people in general, people your age, Liz, and younger, have to value the environment and water and air more than my generation or the generation previously to me did. We just saw it as a means to money and a lifestyle and stuff. And that's, we won't survive that if we continue. We have to do what our ancestors did, is be the caretakers of the environment and not destroy it. And, you know, simply replant trees, grow food, don't make messes, clean up after yourself. Pick up that piece of paper, that kind of thing.
Well, when you take your granddaughter in that walk in the bush and you can show her the rocks and stones.
Yes, I could do that, and that's a big one because it was a huge impact on me. I couldn't imagine. And there are rock piles and rock fences on the property that Phil and Heather have too, and evidence of people who lived there 100 years ago. So they realize that, yeah, and they do appreciate it. And like I said, one of my fortunate things was to have people who could afford to buy the place from me and take care of it, because I planted probably 20,000 trees on that property, and they're still there. Plantations are growing beautifully. Trees are this big now. It's a great area for growing trees. It's not good for growing vegetables.
Wow, it's just a testament to the determination and hard work of your ancestors to make this community thrive.
Absolutely, it was a viable community, any way you looked at it, before and since ACL has established itself here, and we have a very valuable legacy in this town from the scientific and technical work, blood, sweat, and tears that went on at ACL. People worked hard, established this town, and it's going to take progressive thinking to maintain it. Yeah.
Well, from challenges of the past to challenges of the future.
Right now, yeah, we have them, and it just takes work and effort and good, positive, critical thinking. Yeah. Not to criticize, but critical thinking. So what's the best way to do this, and the best way for everybody, not just you or me? Yeah, everybody. Inclusive, not exclusive. Yeah.
Do you have any final thoughts or stories you'd like to share?
These are my thoughts, but my thoughts are based on what I see and evidence, and having been fortunate to live as long as I have. It's far more crucial for our survival to not separate ourselves from the world as we know it, but live with it. We're part of the world. We're not rulers of the world. We're not in control. We're currently out of control, but that symbiotic relationship of living with Mother Nature is far more important than having 2 cars and flying around the world and bragging about how much wealth I have or how much wealth is in the country. The wealth is in the attitude of people to take care of yourself, be your own best friend, not your worst enemy. And that's, to me, was the example I take from my great-grandparents and my parents. They put way more value on education in terms of learning and being as good a person as you can and trying your best when you can do your best. You can't do your best all the time, but when you can, do it. And don't be at odds with others to the point where things don't work, and don't be at odds with yourself where you don't work. We all have to be our own best friends. Not in a selfish, egotistical way, though. Okay? So that's what I learned from going through this process with you, by the way. Yeah, thank you. You're great.
Thank you, Brian. I learned so much.
Good, good.
And I hope this conversation will continue over many more years.
I hope it will. It has to.
Yeah.
It has to.